spooling.
Hi, and welcome to another hour or so with inspiring writers in this truly extraordinary benefit series celebrating Alaska Quarterly Review's 40th anniversary that features readings and conversations with new and emerging writers, as well as established authors and poets who, like today's guests, have all been published in AQR. You can find recordings of previous programs at our website at aqreview.org and our YouTube channel. Today we have three outstanding authors that I feel really fortunate to share the next hour with and hearing from them read their work. I'm Heather Lendy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts, welcome. We're hosted by the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center, so thank you to Cody Carver and to Adam Baldwin for producing today's show, and a huge thank you to our guest writers and also to you for being here. Gunas Chish, as we say in Haines, Alaska, where I am on this sunny afternoon on the snowy banks of the Chilkat River in the homeland of the Tlingit, Jilkat Kwan, and Jilkut Kwan. While this reading is free, AQR, like all literary journals, could use your help. So please consider a donation. And thank you to those of you that have already donated, as we're pretty close to our modest $15,000 goal. And now I'd like to introduce Ronald Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, a recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award. He's also, under Ron's 4 decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created really strong connections between Alaska and the larger literary community, as our guests today are proof. In the US and abroad, and AQR has also been really influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. Ron?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. The event today is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of Indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. Today, as Heather Lendy has told you, we have an amazing trio of fiction writers and nonfiction writers too. Jerome Sharon, Lee Connell, and Debbie Urbanski. Joining me today, you met my co-moderator, and yes, she is the main co-moderator, which makes her, maybe she is the moderator, Heather Lendy. Heather is the author of 4 books, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs. Feel the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and her recently published Of Bears and Ballots. And now back to begin, I send it over to Heather.
Thanks, Ron. It's really my pleasure to introduce our writers for today, beginning with Jerome Sharon, who is a colossus of American letters and the author of 50 books over the last 50 years, including 30 novels, 3 memoirs, 9 graphic novels, 2 books about film, short stories, plays, works of nonfiction, and 2 of his memoirs were named New York Times Book of the Year. His recent novels have fictionalized the lives of Emily Dickinson, Abraham Lincoln, Jerzy Kaczynski, and Teddy Roosevelt. His latest novel, Sergeant Salinger, was released in January. Michael Chabon calls him one of the most important writers in American literature. And Jonathan Yardley of the Washington Post said, "Give this guy a Pulitzer. No one deserves it more." He was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship in Fiction and the Rosenthal Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and was named Commander of Arts and Letters by the French Minister of Culture. He was Distinguished Professor of Film Studies at the American University in Paris until 2009, when he retired from teaching. He lives in New York City now. In addition to writing and teaching, he's a tournament table tennis player, once ranked in the top 10% of players in France. Novelist Don DeLillo called Sharon's book on table tennis, sizzling chops and devilish spins, "The Sun Also Rises of Ping Pong." Jerome Sharon, who said, "I'm not interested in the quotidian in everyday life, the raising of children, family problems, or realistic stories. They just don't interest me. I always have to deal with the kind of extreme. I like to work at the edge. There has to be a certain kind of slant." Lee Connell is the author of The Party Upstairs, as Publishers Weekly noted in a star review of this smashing debut novel, calling it a vivacious microcosm of life inside a Tony Manhattan co-op building. Connell's talent for storytelling, wicked sense of humor, and compassion for her characters will leave readers eager for the next book. She's also the author of the story collection Subcortical, which was awarded the Story Prize Spotlight Award, an Independent Publisher Book Award, and an American Fiction Award. Lori Moore says that Lee Connell is one of the most talented young writers it has been her pleasure to encounter. There is, quote, "nothing she cannot do. She is psychologically astute to the point of eeriness. Her stories are structurally masterful. Her alertness to social class, generational gulfs, the passage of time, and psychological dislocation is her own, not borrowed, and sparkles with intelligence." And I might add, she's also very funny. Lee received a 2020 Creative Writing Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as writing fellowships from the Japan-United States Friendship Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, the Sewanee Writers Conference, Vanderbilt University, and the Yiddish Book Center. Her fiction appears in the Oxford American, Kenyon Review Online, Glimmer Train, and elsewhere. Her stories have won the Nelson Algren Award from the Chicago Tribune and have been shortlisted in Best American Short Stories, including for a story that first appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, as well as have been anthologized with the Pushcart Prizes. Lee Connell, who says, "Stories can expand our sense of self beyond our own individual needs. This feels very important in the world today. For her, writing and reading stories has been, quote, sanity-inducing, helpful, important, like breathing in and out deeply." Debbie Urbanski writes speculative prose or fantastical realism, intertwining the supernatural with everyday reality to bring about worlds on a page that evoke both strangeness and otherness, as well as the thoroughly recognizable commonplace and uncomfortable aspects of domesticity, marriage, motherhood, and community. Her writing often focuses on the intersection of horror, fantasy, science fiction, memoir, and/or the planet. Her stories have appeared in Lightspeed, Fantasy and Science Fiction, The Sun, the Kenyon Review, the New England Review, the Southern Review, Nature, and of course, Alaska Quarterly Review. Her stories have also been selected for the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, the Best American Experimental Writing, and named notable stories or essays of the year for the Best American Mysteries, the Best American Essays, and the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy anthologies. She is a recipient of a 2019 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award for her, quote, stories that draw on larger societal concerns like the hastening destruction of our environment, the recent national wave of xenophobia, or the newly shifting senses of identity and sexuality. She also writes quite frankly about depression. Debbie Urbanski, who said in a Sun interview, "Would the world be better off without us? Would this planet be more beautiful without us? Who or what should be defining beauty? I find these questions interesting," she says, "and worth asking, in the very least as a thought experiment, so that we might be able to find more value in the parts of the world outside of ourselves and make better and more holistic choices moving forward." Her first novel, What Comes After the End, comes out from Pantheon in 2022. And now we will begin with Jerome Sharon.
Thank you very much. The story I'm going to read is The Man from Hard Rock Mountain. And it's a very strange experiment. Lawrence Block put together a series of paintings and etchings and asked us to pick one. Mine is called Twilight of Man by Rockwell Kent. Can you all see it? I hope. And so I was asked to write a story about this very strange happening. And the name of the story is The Man from Hard Rock Mountain. Lawson lived alone. He had a cabin under Hard Rock Mountain at the edge of an old mining town that had rumbled out of existence. Lawson had no electricity or running water. The town had been properly wired, but he lost his dial tone one morning and couldn't get it back. He had no cable service and couldn't seem to charge his cell phone. The mailman had stopped making deliveries and Lawson wasn't even sure if there was a post office connected to the town. He couldn't buy groceries. The stores were shuttered, so he became a scavenger in order to survive. He went from street to street with a crowbar, from cabin to cabin, store to store, even broke into the abandoned motel on Hard Rock Road. He carried a sack with him like a demented Santa Claus, where he found a cornucopia of peanut butter, crackers, jelly, jam, beef jerky, and cans of corn giblets and tomato soup. Enough to last for a year, so he didn't have to do much scouting after that. He had drinking water from an old well behind the cabin, even if the well was full of frogs and the water a little rusty. He had a supply of kitchen matches and a stove that burned balled up paper and clumps of wood. And not all his flashlight batteries had gone to rust. There were no more radio or television stations within miles of Hard Rock Mountain, and perhaps there were none at all. Besides, what did a radio mean without a real electrical outlet? He still had his double gauge and a drawer full of shells, but he hadn't seen the first sign of a squirrel, and there wasn't a fox to be found. All the animals had fled, even the black bear that used to scratch at Larson's trash can. He no longer left much of a trail of trash. He drank water from jars and cans and used the empty boxes of crackers as kindling to prime his pot-bellied stove. He still had a tiny garden. The soil had gone sour and all his carrots shriveled to the ground. He'd once had a cat, Key Largo, but the cat had died on Larson and he buried her behind the cabin. What would he have fed her now? Condensed milk and soda crackers? And Larson suddenly remembered that Key Largo died before the entire population fled, a little at a time. Larson was all alone, without even the comfort of a single bird call. He could still see the smokestacks on the far side of the mountain, but he couldn't remember the last time they'd been fired up. Yet there was a great advantage. No longer bothered by the constant plumes of smoke, he could study the night sky and its enormous quilt of stars. He was content to, in his own way, humming to himself, not even searching for human company. There was none. And then the two strangers appeared, like rag dolls out of the dust. The first was a woman of 27 or so in a simple smock, and the second was a little girl of 5, a creature with big green eyes and rusty red hair, carrying a little jeweled purse close to her tummy. "We're hungry, neighbor," the woman said. "Can you part with some nourishment for me and the little one?" The idea of two companions thrilled Lawson. "Where are you from?" he asked. "From yonder," she said, "over the hill." She had a melodious voice, like the songbirds he missed. "But are there still towns?" he asked. He remembered vague reports of a vast cyber attack, but how vast he couldn't tell. Nothing died at once. The electricity might spark for an hour. His cell phone might suddenly ring, or else Lawson might receive a text from an unidentifiable caller. "Help will arrive." "The towns," she said, "are just like this one. Can you provide us with nourishment, neighbor?" "Yes," he said, "of course I can provide." And Lawson was suddenly alert. He prepared a souffle with powdered eggs. He put ketchup on the table and peanut butter. "Scrumptious," she said, shaking Lawson's hand. "I'm Emma Rothschild, and this is Kathy. You have a lovely daughter with red hair." "I hate to disappoint you. She's sort of my niece by adoption." "I don't understand," Lawson said. Emma was tall and had muscular arms, light blue eyes, and traces of a blonde mustache. "Well, I found her in a somewhat deserted village. She was starving, and I adopted her right on the spot. It was a snap decision." "Didn't her mother object?" "Oh, I answered all her objections," Emma said. Lawson persisted, and Emma grew a little surly. Her eyebrows twitched. "But a mother wouldn't give up a child to a perfect stranger, even in such weird times. That doesn't sound natural to me," Lawson said. "It's perfectly natural. I knew how to feed her, and her mother didn't." "But you have to cadge every single meal," Lawson said. Emma didn't stall. "There's an art to that." Lawson invited this muscular woman with a blonde mustache to stay on with a little girl. "Are you sure we won't be a burden?" Emma asked, watching Lawson with the clear blue eyes of a hawk. "No," he said. "I can make toys for Kathy. I'm pretty good at carving things. And I'm a decent gardener. But the soil's sour. All I could produce was one wilted carrot." "You'll see," Emma said. She worked all afternoon getting rid of the sour clay with her fingernails while Kathy stood beside her like a toy soldier, still clutching a little jeweled purse. They found a tiny bed of dark soil in that vast coffin of clay and planted a few seeds that Emma took out of her pocket. Lawson shuddered once or twice. Emma seemed like a bountiful witch. He carved a little wagon for the girl with wooden wheels. Kathy played with the wagon, imagined it filled with the forest animals that had all disappeared from Hard Rock Mountain. Lawson worried about the nighttime and where Emma would sleep, but she climbed into his bed like a trampoline artist, took off her smock, and straddled Lawson, who was astonished. "If this is some sort of payment, Miss Emma, it isn't necessary." "Silence," she growled, and rode him into some kind of sweet eternity. He never had much luck with women, couldn't seem to reveal his desires, but here she was with that child in the same room, cuddled up on an enormous pillow without much of an expression on her face, as if she'd been observing a pair of acrobats. Lawson couldn't help himself. He was smitten for the first time in his life, in love with a lady who'd arrived out of the dust. Their bodies never touched while they strove to stay alive, with Lawson preparing the meals and Emma ripping the weeds in the garden. It was only at night, with the sweat of their toil still on them, that their bodies clapped together and made a celestial sound. It went on for a month, and then another stranger appeared, a frog of a man who had the collapsed cheeks of the hungry and half-starved. Lawson fed him beans and crackers on the cabin's tiny porch. The frog stopped chewing when he saw Emma and the child. "Jesus, son," the little man whispered. "They're the flesh eaters." "Flesh eaters?" "Cannibals," the little man said. The two of them take over a house and then move on. How the hell do you think they've survived this long? But who told you this? Lawson had to ask. His hands were trembling. It's common knowledge, son. Thanks for the beans. I'd best the moose or I might end up on a skillet. And the frog scattered as fast as he could. Lawson was quiet for 2 hours, yet he wasn't frightened. He'd had a rapturous month with Emma and the little girl. Emma's acrobatics on the bed had rekindled him somehow. He couldn't return to that warp of isolation, no matter who Emma was or what she had done. It was Emma who broke the silence. What did that midget tell you, Lawson? Your cheeks are pale as chalk. He said I'd end up in a skillet if I stayed here in my new cabin. She laughed, and Lawson could see how yellow her teeth were, how sharp. I'm fond of you, Lawson, can't you tell? I found my peace on your pissy mattress. I'm content. But you and the little girl chew on people. Her blue eyes didn't avoid his. Yes. And when our food stock runs low, we'll find some stranger and I'll lure him into your bed. It will be over within a minute. We'll survive. No, he said. This cabin isn't a charnel house. Fine, she said, snapping her fingers. But it's hypothetical, darling. We still have food, and I have some hope in our God. It was never the same after that. He built new toys for Kathy, but she couldn't seem to ignite that little playland of her. And she soon tired of all the toys. She made toys of her own with some bent nails and shards of wood and a tiny silver hammer that she took out of her purse. Kathy's toys made no sense. No matter how hard she knocked, the bent nails wouldn't bite into the wood. She surrounded herself with scatterings and discards and refused Lawson when he offered to help. Lawson still made love to Emma, savored the little tattoo she left with her bite mark, and he'd ride along as she rode on it. Yet he made love like some reptiles with one eye open, and he slept with that same sullen, one-eyed stare. Lawson, it's that little man, poisoned you against us. She clutched at Lawson, brought him out to her little garden with its carrots and tomato vines. Well, she said, I took your clay and revived it some. Is that God's hand or not? Lawson's lips moved with a pronounced whisper. God's, I guess. Other strangers arrived even hungrier than that little frog and scattered after one look at Emma. Lawson had all the evidence he needed. I'm living with a pair of cannibals. But he was strung to them now, even if Kathy was blind to his toys and her own scatterings of wood. She was more amused by her purse, digging at the little jewels until the ornaments were gone. She seemed different to Lawson, with a greater grip on things than Lawson himself had. Her hair was turning blood red, her teeth grew, and her jaw widened. Lawson's coffers were empty. He no longer had powdered eggs for a souffle. The ketchup was all gone. The portions he delivered to the table were less and less copious. Emma, we'll starve pretty soon. And I've been all over town. There's nothing but empty shelves. Don't worry, darling. But how could he not worry? He watched while she washed the kitchen knives with little deft maneuvers. He imagined all sorts of weaponry in her hands. Would Emma and accomplice grind him down with their teeth? I'm frightened, he said. I have to leave. And where will you go, she asked. You're like a baby, Lawson. You get lost climbing Hard Rock Mountain. Stay. She signaled to Kathy, and the two of them departed without a word or a kiss or a wave of their hand. Lawson was miserable in his new isolation. He treasured the black soil of Emma's garden, sifted it, made a mud pile or two. He had no appetite. He lived on a few crackers and lumps of peanut butter. It was a starvation diet. Couldn't sleep. He was restless and morose without the little noises of Emma and the girl. He'd never survive. He hiked up the mountain. There was nothing to hold him there, nothing but rock and hard clay. as if the world itself had gone south and he was some miserable accomplice of the dead. And then they reappeared, rising out of the dust again. Emma Rothschild was radiant with a dark red bloom. The flesh had filled out. She no longer looked like an acrobat, and the little girl had come back with a slight paunch, as if a 5-year-old was suddenly pregnant. He wasn't fooled by their calm demeanor. The two of them had found their prey, had had their fill of human flesh. Lawson was convinced of that. Emma, he muttered, we're still out of food, but she wouldn't let him spoil her homecoming. She fiddled with his hair, caressing his scalp with her calloused hand. She and the little girl had arrived with several sacks of food, olives in a jar, dry cereal, an assortment of muffins. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, Lawson was as hungry as a horse. They watched him chew, listened to the gnashing of his teeth. They were content. Emma and the little girl held hands and didn't even sample the muffin. Will you stop brooding, she asked. I'll try. We came back, Lawson. Isn't that proof enough? Proof, Lawson repeated, like a deranged parrot, that we care for you. We could have stayed on the other side of Hard Rock Mountain. Oh, we had a million opportunities. Isn't that so, little Kate? The little girl nodded her head. All that shaking might have signified nothing at all. Lawson scrutinized Emma while he tore into his 5th muffin. And what did you find on the other side? I've never been. Emma was evasive. People are people, no matter where you go. But have they lost their electrical grid? Oh, it's erratic, same as here. And she lowered him down onto his own bed. Lawson didn't feel any tenderness toward her. He was savage in his need of Emma, but she didn't seem to mind it. He scratched her arms and legs with his long, wolfish fingernails and marked them with ribbons of blood. She laughed. Darling, she said, and he saw little Kate out of the corner of his eye. The ribbons of blood had riveted her. She took the tiny silver hammer out of her child's purse. There was nothing impulsive in her moves, nothing casual. She struck Lawson over the right temple with that little hammer. It wasn't the play of a child. It was a deliberate act. She struck him again while her tongue wandered into her mouth. He looked at Emma, appealed to her with blood bubbling out of his left nostril. She and little Kate hadn't come back out of any concern for Lawson. He was one more chicken about to be plucked. He felt hypnotized by the ham. Little Kate was a tympanum, delivering blows with each lip of her tongue. Lawson reached his hand out to Emma, his fingers twisting in the dusty air of the cabin. But Emma was as neutral as Hard Rock Mountain, as puzzling as the quilt of stars. All Lawson could do was wait for the hammer to fall on the tympan of his skull. Watch and wait.
I think we just need a little breath. Thank you. Lee.
Hi, thank you so much for that reading. And thank you so much to AQR, especially for inviting me to be a part of this. Alaska Quarterly Review was one of the first lit mags that I remember reading, actually cover to cover. So it feels really cool to be here. And thank you to my fellow readers too. So I've written 2 pieces of fiction that have the word party in the title. And I always just wanted to theme a reading around that somehow. So I'm doing that today. One of the parties is my novel, The Party Upstairs, which was published this past summer. And the other is a short story published in AQR called X Party. And the parties in both of these kind of overlap weirdly. I realized when I was thinking about it, both are kind of about power and gender and class. Both have ghosts, sort of. And they're looking at how these forces can affect ideas around art. So I thought what I might do first is just read a little bit from my novel, which I'm just gonna read from the beginning so I don't have to give a lot of backstory. But I'll say the party upstairs is about a middle-aged building superintendent on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Martin, and his 24-year-old daughter, Ruby, who's just moved back in. And Martin has to deal with a lot of different tensions from the kind of increasingly wealthy tenants in the building, and has to manage all of this in his head. So the scene I'm going to read from isn't a party exactly. It's actually a meditation session, which in some ways should be the opposite of a party. But Martin's head kind of lights up with different people. And so, yeah, I'm just going to read a little bit from this meditation scene that he is in the middle of. The opposite of mindful contemplation, probably, was contemplating another man's real estate. Martin's back had gone stiff, his knees creaked, and yet the older he got, the more nimbly his brain made wild leaps through time and space. He was supposed to be here, present, meditating next to his daughter, not thinking about Lily's death or Kenneth's apartments or the pigeons in the courtyard. He breathed in, he breathed out. But then the heat pipe in the living room thumped, and he remembered how the woman in 4B had recently complained about the thumping sound coming from 5B, which was caused by the private tango lessons the woman in 5B was taking with the woman in 2C, who had recently divorced the man who had once lived in 7D, and who had lost his job in advertising just around the time Ruby graduated, and was now in the process of selling his apartment to an heiress whose financial consultant lived in 6C and had complained recently about a leak caused by the attendant to the sick lady in 7C, who poured grease down the kitchen sink, didn't know any better, and who rode the subway from the Bronx every morning with the nanny in 3A, whose young charges tried to poison with cayenne-infused chocolate the pair of yipping Yorkies in 3D, an act of pure malice that didn't much bother anybody, but especially not the attorney in 7A, who had seen the dogs pissing directly onto the red and white impatiens she had asked to be planted in the tree pit outside the building, which were popular flowers with some in the building, yes, but others, like the real estate guy from Lyon in 6B and the financial consultant from Moscow in 8C, felt impatiens were tacky and populist and had tried to advocate for something more elegant, begonias perhaps, and also wanted the green awning to be replaced with a burgundy one. But 9D had argued against both begonias and the burgundy color, mostly because he believed 8C was responsible for bringing in the new team of Russian elevator mechanics who had in the past worked on missiles in what 7C was pretty sure these mechanics still called the motherland, and who 7C was also pretty sure were spies of some sort. A suspicion she had confided exclusively, she thought, to 3A, but 3A blabbered about it to the board members, and her blabbering had backfired, so that now 7C was considered a paranoid woman, a possible isolationist bigot, and a loose cannon, which was probably true since after the attacks on September 11th, 7C had spent weeks in Westchester calling Martin about an oncoming toxic cloud headed for Manhattan, and asking if he could double check that the windows were all the way closed in the apartment, which was actually the same request made by 7B, who recently had maybe got bed bugs. They blamed the house cleaner, leading 4B, once the news got out, to panic and do laundry for 6 hours straight, which really pissed off 1D because they had kids and the kids had soccer practice, and 4B, whose child merely finger painted and did no competitive sports at all, was using all the machines, which 4B said was a necessary thing because didn't 1D hear about the bed bugs in 7B? And 1D said the bed bugs were just a rumor. The bedbug dog from Queens had come in and sensed nothing. But still, the paranoia reached such a pitch that many of 7B's belongings eventually wound up in the basement, and Martin and Raphael, the porter, had to drag armoires and mattresses and books and clothes out into the courtyard and into the alley and up the stairs for the garbage people to take away to waste transfer centers, to barges, to landfills, to landfills, to landfills. Martin's heart, that dumb, flawed blood hauler, made sounds like a garbage truck in his chest. He had fucked up mindfulness again. So there's kind of a big party going on in Martin's head, and his own voice is getting hijacked by this very long sentence with all these tenants kind of yapping at him in some ways. And I kind of like the way that that pairs with the short story I'm going to read a little bit of, Ex Party. So Ex Party is told in this first person plural voice, so this we voice, and it's a bunch of these voices kind of converging into one. And I wasn't sure if that was going to be the voice when I started it. It just was my way in, and it ended up sticking. And so Ex Party is about a party of someone's exes, but you'll see it. When the jasmine-scented letters arrived in the mail that August afternoon, most of us thought they were a joke. You are formally requested to attend a gathering of my ex-lovers at my abode. Wine and summer snacks provided. No plus ones, please. XO Corbin. All of us receiving the invitations were women, and yes, all of us were the ex-lovers of Corbin. We were also med students and administrative assistants and lab techs and artists and cashiers and waitresses and gallery assistants and college students and dancers and librarians and programmers and nannies and journalists. We had many differences, yet we had suddenly been curated without consent, placed together by Corbin into a single mass. Our names weren't even on our actual invitations. Hi, you, was all the cardstock salutation said. Oh, hey, Corbin, you ass. But let's be fair. In some ways, it made sense that Corbin would internally clump us all together, the ex-lovers. A baby, when first born, can differentiate the faces not only of humans, but also of apes. A human baby can tell ape number 23 from ape number 12, no problem. As we get older, though, we can differentiate easily only between human faces. The apes all begin to seem the same to us, melding into one hirsute, not me. Over the months and years, Corbin probably stopped being able to differentiate us as real individuals too. It was not all his fault. It was the fault of time as well, and of the patriarchal, etc. And in general, we tried to be understanding of his limitations. Still, because of who he was, there were certain ways Corbin wasn't limited at all. While our first impulse, as we already said, was to dismiss the invites as a joke, we quickly reconsidered. We all knew Corbin enough to understand that a prank could evolve by the sheer force of his pretentiousness and intergenerational wealth into what he called a performance piece. We might be his subjects, which was kind of gross. All of us said to ourselves, nope, not going. We thought dignity, we thought pride. But when the night of the party arrived, a few of us thought, bellies grumbling, free wine and summer snacks? We were eager to know about these snacks of summer. Also, we were eager to know about each other. Corbin had always been close-lipped about former girlfriends. He liked to say, I don't see myself defined by past relationships. Only now, here he was, defining something about himself with this event. We were just not yet sure what he was defining. And if we didn't attend, we'd never know. All of us arrived at his house exactly 45 minutes after the proposed party start time, meaning all of us had the same definition of fashionably late. We tramped across the greenest parts of his lawn. We eyed the flowers bursting from the shrubs and tried in vain to remember what those flowers were called. We smiled at each other, refusing to size each other up as we said things like, I wasn't going to show here either, is what's funny, but then I just got so curious. We rang the doorbell. Nobody emerged. We knocked. Nothing. At last, we tried the door. It was unlocked. We marched inside. In the living room sat a table stacked with glitteringly dark bottles of wine and with cheese that stank in a way that made the roofs of our mouths smart. We saw crescent slices of green apples, mini caprese skewers, frozen watermelon slices on popsicle sticks, white bean hummus drizzled with lemon juice. There were nearly 24 of us staring at these snacks, but no Corbin. Just a note by the hummus that said, "Out to get more wine, BRB." On the discovery of the note, a long silence. The dashes he'd put in BRB were enraging. They made us think about the way Corbin had narrowed his eyes at us the second we disagreed with one of his theories about life/art/human relationships, or when we brought up, during one of his long-winded spiels about how hard he worked to get where he was, that his grandparents just happened to own buildings in Manhattan and San Francisco that they'd sold for $1 gazillion. In front of the snacks, we took deep, centering breaths. Most of us had shown up to the X party trying to remind ourselves that Corbin wasn't all bad, that it was easy after a breakup to only remember the shitheadiest parts of someone, and that we took a more nuanced view. We made a point before going to the party to remember the thoughtful birthday gifts, the first editions of books we loved, and how mindfully Corbin would ask us about our days at work, and how before sex he would cook elaborate meals for us, full of unexpected ingredients, quail eggs and roasted fennel, and once, upon finding out the many hours of childhood one of us devoted to playing the computer game Oregon Trail, an actual slab of venison. We had gathered to the front of our minds all sorts of goodwill, like a woolly blanket, to keep us from getting too bitterly cold at this X party. But now this, BRB. There's still plenty of wine, we said to each other then, and we began to drink, trying to resist the urge to text Corbin. Less shyly now, we looked around. Some of us wore cocktail dresses, and some of us wore expensive ripped jeans, and some of us wore cheap, non-ripped jeans, and some of us wore blazers despite the heat, as if silken lining might protect us from the possibility of shame. Also, one of us had dressed as a ghost, a light blue sheet over her head. "Because he ghosted me," she said in a low voice through a hole in the sheet. "This invite's the first thing I've heard from him in months." She said she wanted to reappropriate this party, his probable performance piece, as her own performance piece. "I'm wearing the sheet we fucked on," she told us. Her faith in an overwrought pun to reappropriate anything at all, ever, made the hearts of the rest of us sink a little, both because the attempt seemed misguided and because the ghosted pun seemed like one that Corbin himself would utter and delight in. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lee, very much. Debbie.
Yeah, that was a great story. We're very curious what happens. To look it up. And Jerome, that was super powerful too. It's great to be reading with both of you. I wanted to first thank Alaska Quarterly Review, the Anchorage Museum, and Ron Spatz for inviting me to participate in this benefit reading. AQR has played a really important role in my life as a writer for these past 2 decades. They first published me in 2005. And I've really valued the support and encouragement that the magazine and Ron have given me over the years. I think it's rare to have such a well-respected journal take young writers so seriously and then form lasting, nurturing relationships with them. So thank you, Ron. Thank you, AQR. I wanted to read part of a story called You that was first published in The Sun and just recently reprinted in junior great books, which I read as a kid growing up and from 2nd through 8th grade. And it was where I first encountered the short story, first encountered Ray Bradbury. And so I was really thrilled that my work gets to be part of the curriculum. I think of this story as, it's fictional, but as a love letter imagined love letter from my mom to me, and then from me as me to my daughter. You. Your father tells me he wants to turn your bedroom, the empty bedroom he calls it, as he has stopped talking about you and will not say your name, into a guest room. Except, when was the last time anyone visited us here at the edge of the city? Perhaps your room should be a 2nd floor den, he suggests. There's too much light in the room for a den, I tell him. We gave you the brightest room in the house, you know. Then what should the room become, he asks. I was thinking we should leave it as it is, with the window open and the screen removed. That is a very bad idea, your father says. He insists the windows remain closed and locked, as if you now are an unwelcome, a destructive force. Are you a destructive force? I love you as you are now, I told you, when the only difference I could see was a turquoise hue to your skin, to your forehead in particular, and your neck. Can you remember that I told you this? So what, you won't love me after I've changed, you ask, rubbing your hand, which was still a hand then. I didn't answer. The reason I didn't answer is I'm not sure love works like that. Love, not just my love, but anybody's, can't possibly apply to all the potential forms a person, even a daughter, might take, can it? This is love's failure of vision, not mine. You used to look like me. Can you remember that too? Early on, I thought about wiping your memory. I might as well admit this to you now. I thought maybe if you stopped believing you were something else on the inside, then you wouldn't be sad anymore, and you wouldn't change. This was before your body really began to transform. The only reason I didn't go through with the memory wipe was the cost, which was prohibitive. At one point, you left a guide for parents on my side of the bed. This was after that fringe scarf you always wore no longer hid the scales on your chest. There were too many for you to cover now. The guide was a list of do's and don'ts. The list of don'ts was substantially longer. We were not to ask, what is wrong with you? Or why are you changing? Or when could I drive you to the doctor? Or what is happening to your fingernails? Or what about having children? Or what about being happy? Or what about being normal? If you badger your changing child with such aggressive questioning, advised the guide, your child will flee into the trees and never be seen again. Your father and I asked you such questions anyway. We sat you down one afternoon in our spotless kitchen, which has always been your least favorite room of the house, and we asked you those questions and more. I thought it was our right as parents to ask. Your skin sparkling in the sunlight was distracting. Your answers were brief or vague, if you answered at all. I'll never want children, you said. Just you wait, I replied, thinking you surely would later on, as I had. The next morning, you sprang away from me into the old silver maple in our yard. Up you climbed effortlessly, scattering the squirrels. I thought you might not come back down. I was lonely watching you climb higher into the tree, ignoring the branches that tore at your hair. Your father had left for a business trip. The suitcase he had taken with him was extremely large, as if he would be away for a long time. Perhaps I should have texted him a video of you clinging to the tree's crown, or would he have deleted it? In any case, before I could even take a picture, you took flight. So she could fly now, I thought. I know it is no longer supposed to be extraordinary to see those of your generation flying and whatever else you do. Many mothers in our neighborhood remain inside these days and stare ashamedly and hopefully out their windows in the direction of the sky. They call to each other from their porches and take turns speaking their daughters' names. You were beautiful when you flew, your sinuous veined wings extended for the first time, your blue-green skin trailing behind you. Or maybe it wasn't your skin. I don't know how to describe you anymore. I'm told the younger generation is growing disinterested in maintaining a stable form. You were beautiful to me too many years ago when you sat close to me in the kitchen and shared a quiet dinner of pasta garnished with cut tomatoes, when you were still wingless and looked like a little girl, when you were a girl. Couldn't there be something dazzling and worthwhile in such a simple memory, in its ordinariness and lack of fire and magic? You didn't need to grow wings to be beautiful. I was never a girl, you said to me, despite the photographs I stacked in front of you, my piles of proof. What were you then? I asked. I was something else, you said. But you didn't look like something else, I reminded you. You looked like a girl. You looked like my child. I was never your child, not really. I don't think all your answers to my questions were correct. In the old stories, the myths, your sort of transformation would have happened through a curse. You might have angered a god, and that god might have turned you into something else, some sort of animal, a swan or a cow. I would have preferred that. I could have learned how to care for a cow. People would have understood and pitied me, and you as well. Rarely have I heard any myths about a young woman choosing to turn into something unrecognizable all on her own. We were not in need of a new type of story, you know. I burned the parents' guide in the fireplace in our family room while you were crouched in the tree. Then I considered wiping my own memory. But of course, we didn't have money for that either. I might have been able to change too in less dramatic ways at an earlier point in my life, but I did what was expected of me. There is something to be said for doing what is expected of us, for becoming what is expected. Another time I saw you hunched behind the garage beside the compost pile, engaged in some repetitive action that I didn't understand, doing something with whatever replaced your hands. It looked as if you were digging. You were digging with frustration and urgency. I didn't know how to help, so I knelt beside you. Eventually, I dug with you. Can you remember this? That there was nothing buried in the soil? We found nothing. Then I reached out and touched a part of you, a leftover part of who you had been. I had always wanted a daughter, I used to think. As my daughter grows, I will have so much to share with her. I will teach her how to watch without sadness the afternoon light fade in the kitchen. I will teach her to apologize, even when it isn't her fault, to keep the peace in her house, and how to rub away a child's growing pains in the dark, and how to make promises you always intended to keep, and the comfort that comes with knowing one's future for the rest of one's life. What can I teach you in your current state? What do you need to know that I could tell you? You were always a little bored of me. We did not have much to talk about, even in the beginning. Can you at least try to remember our silences as comfortable? I did my best to fill the silence between us with love. This is not about my love anymore, is it? This is not about you at all, you have said to me. But I am the one telling the story. Try to remember that. It's only fair that the person who is left behind gets to tell the story. This is a very different story, I know, from the one you would tell. You had begun to stand in front of the wall mirror in my bedroom without a shirt on. This was around the time you turned 12. The scales had not yet emerged, and your skin was not yet discolored. So I assumed wrongly that you were taking note of how puberty was affecting your body. I wanted to sit you down and tell you about the changes that were happening, so you would not fumble blindly into sexual maturity as I had. When I asked, what do you know about how pregnancy happens? You walked to the other side of the room. That doesn't apply to me, Mom, you said from the doorway. Oh, girls your age, they all say that sort of thing at first, I assured you. Several times I tried to restart the conversation, but you refused to engage with me. You wanted to talk instead about what you saw when you looked in the mirror. You said you saw 2 wings extending from your upper back. You asked what I saw when I looked at myself in the mirror. Did I have wings? I did not have wings. You asked, do you see my wings? I did not yet see yours, though at times I thought I could feel them brushing rhythmically against my shoulders. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Debbie, Annalee, and Jerome. And I think it's, for reading, especially fiction right now, and especially when we're talking about the future of literary arts in a way, and arts journals like AQR. And I was hoping that you might all want to perhaps have a little chat about the importance of writing fiction, and like the stories that you just shared in our world today, and just have a conversation amongst yourselves about it. Just briefly, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but having all 3 of you here is a great opportunity to learn. So I'm hoping you have a few more minutes. And I don't know, I know Jerome has been eager to add to this, and maybe as our elder statesman here would like to jump in first.
Well, I started out as a painter, but had no talent whatsoever. So I turned to words, and I was very lucky coming from a very poor family. In the olden days, you still could go to a university and not be bankrupt for the rest of your life. So I had the best possible education in the world. We read books every day, all day. We were in colloquiums together with extraordinary professors, and the word became holy to me. So it had nothing to do with publishing or printing. It was just sculpting words, becoming involved with language. It had nothing to do with career or anything. I felt that I would have to be an apprentice all my life in order to study language. And this is and I get the same enjoyment now as I did 60 years ago when I faced the page. And I think I'm blessed with that, no matter what is out there in the world as it changes. The rhythm of language is still inside my head, and it gives me the same pleasure to write.
Lee or Debbie, have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the way Jerome put that feels really true to me and really beautiful. And I think for me, the act of writing and the act of reading fiction feels like an act of attention. I know I just read like a sort of chaotic meditation scene, but to me, like that process of putting words together, of sort of building a character's mind, or thinking about even the mysteries that the character won't reveal, like that all feels like an act of love and an act of attention, even if what shows up on the page can feel very goofy sometimes. So yeah, for me, I think if I didn't have that, it would be really hard for me to be more aware of the stories that I live by, consciously and unconsciously. And I think writing fiction, it feels like this thing that makes the world feel less blobby to me. And like that's almost the best way I can put it. It sharpens things in a way that helps me see better.
Now you had a novel just come out this year during the whole pandemic. I mean, how did that change your thought of the encouraging people to read fiction now, or the value of it, considering and it's not only the pandemic, of course, just the whole world is like upside down. I imagine Jerome or Ron might have even a different perspective on this and say it always has been, but it just seems like this has been particularly not so great. Any thoughts on how that related to all of this, or?
Yeah, well, with my novel in particular, was writing about a building super and his daughter and the different ways they kind of feel invisible in this building, and also other people that they kind of treat a little bit as invisible. There's all these different ways of not totally seeing each other. And one thing about the pandemic, especially at the beginning, that was interesting to me was a lot of different rhetoric in terms of essential workers and whose work we acknowledge and see and how that matters. And I think what I love about writing, and also what I think reading can do, is it opens those stories up even more. So there's a lot of things that were sort of a bummer about publishing a first novel during this time, but it was interesting when I thought about the actual content and what I was sort of trying to grapple with. It was an interesting time for it to come out.
Debbie, your work, just the story that you just read is it's so current, really, and seems of the moment so much. And I don't know how long ago you wrote it, but then also you're in the process, right, of finishing a novel now, I assume, or doing some of the final edits. And what about that? What about fiction now as a way to address, the issues that you tackle, and did anything change because of these times, or is fiction in and of itself reflective, or is it something wholly different?
It was interesting, Lee, saying that fiction reading and writing is an act of attention, because when COVID first ramped up in March and April, and maybe even May, I found myself unable to read novels, and I was just reading guides to edible foods for some that comforted me, like guides to wild, how to identify and eat weeds and that sort of thing. So that was something felt wrong with my life on a lot of levels, but in particular the loss of reading was huge. So, and I couldn't focus. I was just reading the news the whole time. So when I finally got back to novels, I kind of eased myself back into it, but it did realign my life in some way. And it reminded me that there's more to life than what I'm experiencing and what I could see. And I feel like that was really important to, in the midst of COVID, to remember. In terms of writing, so my first novel is actually about a virus that causes humanity to go extinct. So it was strange. I had been writing it for a while when COVID happened, but it was pretty eerie and awful in a lot of ways to see things play out. But yeah. The role of fiction in my own life, I do tend to write about personal things through a speculative lens, and I like to think that it's filling some kind of gaps in the world when I haven't seen my own experience reflected. So I look for those gaps, and then I find a way to fill them, I guess.
And Jerome, you're now, you're in your 80s, right?
Yes.
And do you have like a sense of even more urgency to write, fiction, and if so, what kind of stories? Because you're still, there's another book that just came out, and you're working on another collaboration. I mean, what keeps you driving forward, and is there something that you really want to make sure we read?
It's the sound. I watched a documentary on Maria Callas, and I fell in love with her, really. I would have married her if she was still alive. And so I decided, even though I didn't attend that many operas, I decided I wanted to write a novel about her. So I began to read everything I could, and began to see that nobody understood what she had done and how she sang. So there's always a new adventure that is in front of you, and I'm finishing a novel on Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles. And it was terrible to read about Rita Hayworth's life. She was raped by her father when she was young, and she had Alzheimer's when she was very young, when she was in her 60s. And yet I tried to craft a novel around the powers that she had. So I still feel that there are things out there that appeal to me and that I want to write about. I mean, and to sort of, I'm not rooted in speculative fiction. I mean, I grew up during World War II, so much of my fiction goes back to that earlier age, to the Second World War, because I was a very young child then. And in the last novel I just published in January called Sergeant Salinger, which is about J.D. Salinger going through World War II. People don't realize that he was a soldier who went through the entire war from Utah Beach to the concentration camp. So I just feel that if there's something out there that I want to possess, I try to possess it.
I can't let you leave without asking you about the connection between table tennis and writing while we have you here. Is it purely recreation, or does they feed upon each other?
There's a song to the racket. It's very much like writing, and I'm left-handed, so I have, I was a tournament player. So your object when you're playing a tournament is not only to win, but to kill your opponent. It's very violent, even though it's very gentlemanly. But the sound of the ball was very reassuring, and I often play with my agent who's in his 90s, and he gets better as I get worse. But it's something reassuring about, I haven't been able to play in over a year, and who knows when I'll be able to play again. But I look forward to my next match.
Well, thank you. And Debbie, I did want to ask you, because you write about now spending a lot of time walking in your farm area, it sounds like, and you use a jeweler's loop. I mean, talk about going from big picture to the minutia. I mean, is that what's the connection there with your work?
I'm in the city of Syracuse, but in my backyard, I've been trying to carve out a space. I mean, and I've learned even dandelions could be gorgeous if you look at them closely enough. So yeah, I do have a little tiny loop that my husband got me that blows things up to ×10 in this beautiful way. I am really interested in the natural world. My book deals a lot. It's the idea of humans versus what to value, humans versus the world. And my book kind of questions if we always need to choose humans on that scale. But so I have been interested in exploring non-human stories. I haven't successfully done it yet, but I am curious about playing around with language, or maybe it will be more visual. I'm not sure how to get a non-human perspective into writing. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Thank you. And Lee, in writing the scene with Martin and the meditation, which I love, because during this time I've tried to meditate, and I don't have a whole apartment building I'm keeping track of, but my head just goes zzz. Are you somebody that, do you do that? Do you do meditation, yoga? What's the thing that you do outside of your work that sort of helps keep you breathing?
Yeah, I've had a lot of really bad meditation sessions during the pandemic. I guess you're not supposed to call them bad because it's all an experience. But it's funny, the two things that Martin does to try to cope in this novel are he does some bird watching and he meditates. And those are actually both things that I find sort of slow my brain down, and that can be a really valuable thing, especially lately. Even though there's, like Martin, I also have a lot of spinny thoughts, which if you can just sort of breathe and take a step back from them, they become really interesting. But the taking the step back can be a challenge in itself.
Well, thank you. This has just been really, really enlightening, enjoyable, kind of mind expanding. So thank you all for being here. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add before we go. I don't want to keep you any longer because we're already a little over. But if there's something else that each of you feel that you need to say before we go, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Ron to say goodbye to everybody. Nope, we good. Well, thank you. And on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, thank you and thank you for being here, and have a safe week. Take care of yourselves, and if you're able to, take care of somebody else too. And Ron?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And I want to echo what Heather just said. I want to thank the three of you, Jerry, for taking the time out, and for all of the vision and all of the work for all of the years that you have mentored and inspired so many people. Lee, thank you for your support and for reading today. And Debbie, you even remember the year that you started with us. So it's been kind of a long haul, although I think that Jerry was in, I think he may have been in our first or second issue, a long time ago. So it's really great to have you. So for those watching, we have 5 more events in our series coming up. 2 weeks from today, Sunday, April 11th, we start our National Poetry Week celebration. So we have 3 events in a row, 3 Sundays in a row with poets. So on Sunday the 11th, we have Sophie Clark, Victoria Chang, and Kimiko Han. And so that's going to be amazing. They're all going to be amazing. Sunday, April 18th, Nikki Beer, Mary Peelan, and Alexandra Teague. And Sunday, April 25th, Virginia Conchin, Elise Noor, Kate Partridge, and Heather Tressler. May 2nd is a CODA event. We're building suspense about it. We'll probably in a couple of weeks announce what we're going to be doing. We already know, and we have everybody lined up, but it's the CODA. And you know, the CODA is what is something you move on from. In other words, we had this really big series celebrating our 40th anniversary. And so it's a milestone, but we look at it as a first step now. You're not going to keep accruing time. We're going to leap from that milestone. And the CODA will be the first in that journey. So thank you, everybody. And Heather, again, thank you. And Jerry, thank you. Lee, thank you. And Debbie, thank you.
Bye.
So thank you all, guys. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thanks for organizing all this. This must have been quite a project, Ron. So